Awaken your shadow. The truth sets some people free. It offends everyone else. By Seth, the Red Neo, Cherupak.
Chapter 10. Your Divine Right to Justice. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? T.S. Eliot, The Rock. Envy is the shadow of admiration. It wants what another has without wanting to become what made it possible. Seth Cherupak. Justice begins when the heart refuses to negotiate with a lie. Seth Cherupak. Justice without healing is a verdict that echoes longer than the crime. It is a storm that clears nothing, only scatters the wreckage. Seth Cherupak. Part 1. Foundations of the Intuitive Self.
Your intuitive self is the greatest threat to the Matrix and the spiritual predators in this book. It exposes their most formidable weapon, which I'll reveal in a moment, and gives you the tools to disarm it quickly. It cuts through the deceptions of Mammon, who cloaks fear in the language of caution. It exposes the lies of Asmodeus, who frames recklessness in the language of enjoyment. It calls out Belphegor, who rationalizes conformity in the language of responsibility. It tears off the mask from Beelzebub, who cloaks imitation in the language of influence. It rebukes Leviathan, who cloaks ignorance and envy in the language of knowledge, wisdom, and superiority. It is even a threat to Lucifer, who conceals the dark polar twins of pride, self-pity, and self-righteousness in the costumes of humility and enlightenment. Without the guidance of your intuitive self, any or all of your other selves can be aligned against you and recruited to do the bidding of the builders of the Matrix. The Matrix will tolerate and even reward almost anything on the surface: your career and financial success, your hunger for freedom and autonomy, your drive for adventure and achievement, your healthy and aligned relationships, your ability to influence and inspire, your pursuit of knowledge and education, your spiritual practices, affirmations, and even your prayers. It will tolerate your intellectual or theological arguments and even your carefully curated spiritual identity. Its empire doesn't require your failure or your faith in any specific belief system. The Matrix only requires your conformity to its endless buffet of mental programs. The takers achieve this by leveraging their most deceptive tool for turning the signal of your intuition into the noise of ignorance and confusion. They cannot imprison your spirit, so they imprison your mind by filling it with monkey chatter that distorts, disguises, or buries the voice of your intuition. This confusion wears two faces: the fog of indecision and self-doubt, the rigid certainty of dogma disguised as truth. These appear to be opposites, but the principle of polarity exposes them as two heads of the same snake. Some people spend their lives swinging between these poles. Others remain snagged on one side or the other. Either way, those under this spell of false polarity are easy to herd. They either second-guess their purest perceptions or refuse to question the beliefs they've inherited. At both poles, we find people who outsource their discernment to experts, influencers, algorithms, and institutions. They rely on belief systems and experts to tell them what is real, what is moral, what is safe, and what is possible. This is why the takers wage war on your intuitive self. They know that the more you hear, discern, and trust the quiet, precise knowing that lies beneath your thoughts, the more ungovernable you will become. Government is a word that combines the Latin words gubernar, to steer, to control, and mens, mind. When combined into one word, this word labels what the takers are openly doing to us. They hide their secret agenda in plain sight. Despite this blatant admission, billions of people around the world and throughout history consent to this master-slave social and often legal contract of mind control, while the takers proudly present themselves as the rightful rulers of your mind. Your intuitive self doesn't argue against the dogma of the matrix or the deceptions of the spiritual predators. It doesn't shout. It doesn't flood you with dramatic signs or long explanations. To do so would be to snag itself on the dogmatic side of the pendulum of confusion, or to entangle itself in the foggy pole of anxious overthinking. It doesn't rehearse every possible outcome, replay every conversation, or ask 1,000 what-if questions in a desperate attempt to be seen or validated. It doesn't outsource its discernment to experts, talking heads, or shifting official narratives, even in times of crisis like the lockdowns of 2020, when the crowd is rewarded for doubting what their own bodies already know. To do so would be to snag itself on the anxious, self-doubting side of the pendulum. It doesn't even interpret. It simply says, this is true, this is not. Walk here, don't walk there. Move now, or stand still. It says these things in a language that your body understands before your mind ever forms words. This is where intuition stops being a mystical ornament and becomes a moral faculty. Your intuitive self reveals truth not merely so you can feel wise, but so you can judge rightly, set boundaries cleanly, restore balance where distortion has taken root, and refuse to cooperate with lies dressed as love, authority, safety, or enlightenment. Intuition is the eye. Justice is the hand. One sees the imbalance, the other corrects it. The builders of the matrix cannot allow you to live by this voice, so they fight you on two fronts. At one pole, they flood you with competing truths and official narratives until you doubt what you already know, second-guessing every signal your body sends you. At the other pole, they harden you into certainty around borrowed interpretations, so you no longer ask whether they're actually true. In both cases, they trap you in the pendulum, either swinging between the poles or snagged on one side. They accomplish both by exploiting your natural impulse to search for meaning in everything. Instead of letting your intuitive self show you function, what something is actually doing in your life, they seduce you into decoding, analyzing, and spiritualizing. This is their greatest weapon for sowing confusion and division, and for herding you into one of their many boxes for your consciousness. This is how we've ended up with a world where people know more about everything and understand almost nothing. We live in an age that mistakes information for intelligence and symbolism for spirituality. Scroll through social media on any given day and you'll see it. Angel numbers, horoscope reels, prophetic word of the day, endless interpretations of signs and synchronicities. None of these things are inherently evil. Sometimes God does use the language of symbols to remind you that life is magical, that you are seen, that you are not alone. But the Matrix has a way of turning sacred reminders into cages. You see 11:11 on the clock, and instead of feeling wonder, your mind floods with questions. What does it mean? Is this a sign? Am I missing something? Is God trying to warn me? You start consulting card pulls, collective readings, numerology charts, and strangers on the internet, as if heaven were a code to be cracked rather than a relationship to be lived. This is the meaning trap. The moment we replace what is this doing with what does this mean, we sign a contract with the spiritual predators that possess us with the poison-thorn crowns of envy, pride, and blasphemy. The meaning trap is what happens when you spend your life asking, what does this mean, but never ask, what does this do? You lose yourself in interpretation and never touch function. Meaning becomes a hall of mirrors, each reflection pointing back to your own projections, fears, and fantasies. You begin to mistake your mental commentary for divine guidance. This is why ignorance is never a neutral condition. It is not merely the absence of information, but the refusal to let truth complete its work. The moment truth is reduced to interpretation, justice is delayed, boundaries rot, evil gains time to organize, and what should have been corrected is forced to metastasize. Your intuition is a quiet but persistent voice. If you silence it through self-medication, literal drugs, distractions, busyness disguised as productivity, amusement disguised as recreation, etc., or by filtering your intuition through their systems of thinking, the takers have succeeded in blinding you, not by closing your eyes, but by cluttering your field of vision. They tell you that truth requires interpretation, not presence. They teach you to think in doctrines, not discernment, to trust in diagnostic manuals, not in the living wisdom of your body. They teach you to chase information instead of knowledge, symbols instead of substance, and meaning at the expense of clarity. They drown your intuitive self beneath an avalanche of commentary until you no longer trust your own perception without external validation. The takers have achieved this with breathtaking precision by installing these seemingly profound questions into the minds of every spiritually curious person. Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? These questions seem profound because they're hard to answer, but that is not a signal of depth. It's proof that God is not in the equation. God is not the author of confusion, and there are no questions about which the world is more confused and divided than these. These are not questions that lead to enlightenment, but into mental and spiritual slavery. The person who is searching for the meaning of life has lost the value of life as an end in itself. Life lives, it expands, it grows, it creates after its own image. As Erwin Schrödinger observed, life creates order from order, not from chaos. That is what it does, and that's all that matters. Accept this, then align your identity, beliefs, words, and actions with the divine principles that perform the functions of life. This is the only meaning you will ever need, and its truth will set you free. Meaning is the most deceitful distraction and a wicked tool for creating division and confusion. It's the candy coating on the greatest poison pill of them all, seeking meaning instead of understanding function. We do this when we see an angel number, 111, 222, 333, 444, and spiral into a search for what it means. Angel numbers are God reminding us that life is magical. Function is the hidden pearl of wisdom. It doesn't care how poetic your interpretation is. It doesn't care how many books you've read or how many esoteric systems you've studied. It doesn't care about the thousands of well-scripted social media reels and videos that teach us how to decode the positions of the stars, the planetary bodies, or the days on our calendar, or even the symbols in your dreams. Most of this content is created not by people sharing a revelation from God or even their intuition. Most of it is the byproduct of AI prompts that compress the knowledge on the internet into its common denominators. This is the byproduct of our impulse to seek meaning in things that God gave us not to decode, but to see and accept their function and plan our best response. Meaning and interpretation expand our thinking to the point where we're overwhelmed by interpretations and possibilities. Function asks clearer and more ruthless questions like, what is this job, this business, or this house actually doing to me? Is this belief, practice, or sign spinning me in endless analysis, waiting for confirmation from God before I act on what my heart already knows? Is this relationship making me more confident, present, truthful, courageous, and loving? Spiritual people spend more time analyzing, defending, or rationalizing relationships with someone who they believe is their soulmate than they spend asking what the relationship is doing to them or the other person. They spend too much time asking whether a new business venture or marketing strategy is God's will, and not enough asking what impact the business is having on them or the world. If it's burning you out, bringing out the worst in you, or filling you with fear and doubt, that's what matters. Confusion, doubt, fear, shame, guilt, grief, and bitterness come when you turn your attention away from the function of such things and toward the exhausting task of trying to decode their meaning. God is not the author of confusion, nor the author of escapism through spiritual bypassing. Any spiritual path that leads you deeper into indecision, dependency, or self-obsession is not a spiritual path. It's an endless maze built from meanings that never cash out into function, a maze riddled with dead ends, loops, and traps where every new insight becomes another detour to nowhere. This is why perfectionism and escapism so often masquerade as spiritual depth. Perfectionism says, I can't move until I understand everything. Escapism says, I don't want to move, I just want to feel like I've transcended. Both are allergic to the clarity that comes from seeing and accepting function. Both keep you seeking meanings that never demand courage or initiative. Your intuitive self is the signal embedded in this noise. It is the guide out of this maze of spiritual bypassing and into a place where true transcendence becomes not only possible, but inevitable. Intuition is not the art of assigning mystical significance to random events. It is the capacity to sense the functional truth of a situation before your mind has collected enough data to justify it. It is the way your body, spirit, and awareness collaborate to say, this is aligned, that is not, even when you can't yet explain why. In a world built on manipulation, this kind of knowing is dangerous. The matrix depends on your willingness to question yourself more than you question the structures that profit from your confusion. It trains you to distrust your instincts while worshiping its metrics, follower counts, credentials, citations, consensus. If enough people agree, it must be true. If a system is complicated, it must be wise. If a voice is confident, it must be right. Underneath this conditioning is a deeper program, the belief that you are not fit to interpret reality without supervision. From childhood, most of us were taught to silence the intuitive self in favor of compliance. You were told what to believe, what to fear, what to want, and what to ignore. You were rewarded for parroting approved meanings and punished for seeing what didn't fit the script. At school, the right answers were pre-selected. In many religious communities, questioning those answers was branded as rebellion. In families, speaking the unspeakable often meant threatening the fragile meanings that held everyone's denial together. So you learned to override the knowing that lived in your gut, your chest, your bones. You learned to doubt the part of you that saw through appearances. You learned to bow to collective meaning even when it violated functional truth. The result is a culture of highly informed, deeply confused people. We can define trauma in 9 different ways, but can't feel when a relationship is slowly killing our soul. We can recite theology or quote scripture in 3 languages, but can't discern when a leader's energy contradicts their words. We can list the symptoms of narcissism, anxiety, or attachment patterns, but can't sense when our nervous system is screaming, get out or stay. We chase meanings and miss functions. We exalt information and ignore wisdom. Wisdom is what happens when knowledge submits to function. Justice is what happens when wisdom refuses to betray what function reveals. Function is how knowledge behaves when it incarnates material form. A principle can be explained 1,000 ways, but its reality is revealed in what it does, how it moves through your choices, relationships, body, and destiny. There is a world of difference between describing gravity and living as if gravity exists. A world of difference between debating love and actually loving someone when it costs you. As the Dhammapada, verse 100 from the book The Thousands, says, Though one may recite 1,000 verses of meaningless words, better is one verse of the law, hearing which one becomes tranquil. Here the Buddha reminds us that truth's purpose is transformation, not accumulation. True knowledge calms, not confuses. It brings order, not noise. The Tao Te Ching, Book 33, echoes this pattern as it manifests in the realm of self-awareness. Knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is true wisdom. To know yourself, you must first recognize what is you and what is the result of external programming, seeing through the borrowed patterns and narratives that once kept you safe but now keep you bound. I will add that knowing God is the height of all wisdom, and we know God not through intellect or past experience, and certainly not through the meanings we assign to things. This echoes Paul's exhortation in Romans 12:2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The Greek word for conformed, syschematizo, means to be pressed into an external mold. The word for transformed, metamorpho, means to be changed from within. Knowing yourself is the art of this inner metamorphosis, shedding borrowed meanings to reveal the signal embedded in the noise and chatter of the matrix. This scripture tells us that this is how we know the will of God, not through the interpretations imposed on us by others, but in the still, small voice of unadulterated intuition. This voice is lost, distorted, or weaponized against ourselves, others, and God when we attempt to interpret it through survival scripts, the stories driven by grief, shame, guilt, or bitterness. Your intuition reveals pure truth. We distort it when we let our wounds assign it meaning. This is the difference between discernment and accusation, between revelation and projection. Intuition receives truth cleanly. Wounded pride, grief, shame, guilt, and bitterness rush to weaponize it. The first serves justice. The second performs a counterfeit of justice while serving envy, punishment, and moral inversion. This is how even spiritually gifted people turn from serving God to serving themselves. This is the cold, throbbing heart at the center of cult dogma. For what is a cult but a religion without love? Atheists are especially prone to such dogmatic thinking, often assigning meaning to things not to seek God, but to avoid Him. Spiritual seekers do it too, looking for patterns in everything, posting spiritualized interpretations on social media, producing long cult-like videos about the new earth, the chosen ones, or picking the right side in the battle between good and evil. Yet the true battle is not between good and evil, but between conformity and divine discernment, the difference between the deepity-doos, words or sayings that sound profound but say nothing, and the living wisdom that requires transformation. The Matrix thrives on spiritual slogans that sound like revelation but dissolve under honest scrutiny. They keep you oscillating between emotional comfort and intellectual paralysis, mistaking noise for depth. The intuitive self sees through this illusion. It does not ask, "Does this sound true?" It asks, "Does this function in truth?" To function in truth is to align with the divine principles that govern both the material world of effects and the immaterial world of causes. The Kena Upanishads affirm this discernment. Book 1, verse 5. That which makes the tongue to speak but needs no tongue to speak, that alone is God, not what people here worship. This verse points us beyond the tongue that speaks only in words and toward the transcendent mind behind all language. It speaks of the silent awareness that speaks through presence rather than through words. This same current of truth flows through Psalm 36:9, saying, "For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light." When the spirit within you perceives truth, it does not analyze, it recognizes. In that recognition, intellect bows to revelation. Science itself hints at this mystery. Neuroscience calls it predictive processing. the brain's way of using prior experience to interpret data. But intuition transcends prediction. It is the spirit interpreting what the data cannot yet explain. I remember a moment in my life when truth challenged the meanings I had assigned to things. I was in a relationship that I believed was divinely orchestrated, but it was literally tearing my life apart. Through a conversation with a man named Andre, I heard a mere man speak from his heart and his intuition. I was mid-sentence, tangled in one of my spiritual-sounding rationalizations about my toxic relationship. I was listing reasons, defending decisions, spinning webs of meaning. Andre listened, patient and still, and when I finally stopped to breathe, he leaned forward and said 6 words that cut through the fog like a blade. "Brother, God is not the author of confusion." In a split second, this truth cut through all the noise of the meaning I had assigned to the relationship. Andre heard none of that. All he heard was how the relationship was disrupting my sleep, destroying my financial life, stripping me for parts like a junkyard car, and moving me away from God. His words landed in my gut before they reached my mind. For a moment, everything inside me went still. The hum of the cafe faded, the clatter of dishes disappeared, and all I could hear was the resonance of that single truth vibrating through my chest. Something in me knew. The relationship was over. I didn't know how or when, but I knew it was done. Truth had spoken, and truth is its own witness. It doesn't need to be defended or looked up. It simply is. That moment was more than a single revelation. I understood, not through logic, but through recognition, that real truth defends itself the way a lion does. It doesn't argue, it roars. As C.S. Lewis said, you don't have to defend a lion. All you have to do is let it out of its cage. This is exactly what the Matrix fears most. It wants to build cages for your intuition, layers of doubt, analysis, and dependency, because once the lion is loose, once your intuitive self awakens, you no longer need their systems to tell you what is real. Spiritual predators hate this. They rely on your hesitation, your need for validation, your addiction to external meaning. They want your discernment outsourced, your knowing diluted. But the moment you let truth roar through you, unapologetically, functionally, in real time, you become a threat to every structure built on confusion. Your divine right is not merely the right to accumulate knowledge or hoard information. It is your divine right to stand in unmediated relationship with truth, to judge what you see without surrendering your conscience to the crowd, and to let that truth move you toward justice within your own life, within your relationships, and wherever imbalance demands correction. As Proverbs says, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search it out. Proverbs 25:2. To search it out is to hear the voice of your heart, and do your best to translate its message into words that preserve and communicate the revelation without twisting it to fit your survival scripts or the mental programs installed by the builders of the Matrix. You were not meant to live as a permanent student of other people's meanings. You were meant to become a partner in revelation itself, a living participant in the restoration of right order, in the exposure of counterfeit authority, and in the sacred task of calling things what they are before corruption has the chance to rename them. Your intuitive self is the faculty that makes this partnership possible. It is the part of you that can look at the same data as everyone else and hear a different instruction. It is the part of you that refuses to outsource your discernment, no matter how impressive the experts or how loud the crowd. It is the whisper that says, search this out for yourself. Test this. Watch what it does. You have met your divine guardian, your trailblazer, your ruler, your lover, and your messenger. Each self has prepared you for the awakening of your intuitive self. You awaken this divine counselor not by learning more about intuition, but by hearing, trusting, and following its voice as it speaks in a language that transcends words. New subheader: The Intuitive Self in Relationships. The intuitive self is the quiet light between two souls, the unseen language of truth that passes through the silence when words lose their power. In every relationship, it is the force that perceives before thought, that feels before understanding, and that reveals what is real before either person has found the courage to say it aloud. It is the living eye of the relationship, the shared vision that keeps love honest. When the intuitive self is awake, the third entity begins to see itself. You can sense when something is off before it turns into conflict, when a tone hides pain, when a smile covers grief. You can feel the tremor in another's energy and recognize it not as a threat, but as information. This self does not argue, interpret, or diagnose. It listens beneath language, reading the current of truth that runs under the surface of conversation. It notices how the energy between you shifts when fear enters the room, and how it softens when kindness returns. It speaks through instinct, through the tightening of your chest, the warmth in your gut, the electricity in your skin. It speaks through dreams, synchronicities, and quiet conviction, the gentle but undeniable awareness that says, this is true or this is not. Every relationship becomes confused when the intuitive self is buried. Without it, you rely on appearances. What was said, what was promised, what was posted. You lose touch with what the energy is actually doing. You begin to confuse performance with presence, emotion with empathy, talk with truth. You chase meaning instead of function, demanding signs, explanations, and closure when what's needed is stillness. The more you interpret, the less you see. The more you analyze, the less you know. Relationships drown in the noise of speculation, each person trying to read the other through filters of fear and memory. The intuitive self does not play this game. It trusts what it knows and releases what it cannot verify. It doesn't demand proof before peace. It doesn't need to win an argument to restore connection. It doesn't weaponize silence or explanation. It simply observes and responds. In this way, it becomes the relationship's inner compass, the steady signal beneath the static. It reminds you that knowing is not controlling and that clarity is not cruelty. It keeps you from mistaking suspicion for discernment or cynicism for wisdom. It lets truth breathe, and because it lets truth breathe, it allows justice to enter the room without dragging vengeance in behind it. When you live through your intuitive self, conversation becomes cleaner. You stop interrupting the space between words with rehearsed defenses or borrowed scripts. You begin to sense what another person is truly asking for, sometimes comfort, sometimes accountability, sometimes nothing at all. You can feel when to speak and when to let silence do the work. You can feel when forgiveness is ready and when distance is necessary. This is how intuition loves, not by solving, fixing, or decoding, but by knowing what love is doing in real time and responding with grace. The shadow of this self is envy disguised as insight, the compulsion to know everything, to prove that you see more deeply than the other, to turn discernment into superiority and sight into a throne. This counterfeit wisdom makes you suspicious of sincerity and hungry for secrets. It collects meanings like trophies, quoting scripture and psychology to sound discerning while avoiding the humility of presence. In this shadow, intuition becomes paranoia, knowledge becomes comparison, connection becomes competition. You start treating the person you love as a mystery to master rather than a presence to honor. The relationship suffocates under your need to be right, and envy quietly appoints itself judge, jury, and false witness. But when the intuitive self is integrated, kindness returns to knowing. You no longer seek power through information. You seek peace through understanding, truth through presence, and justice without humiliation. You use your sight not to expose, but to illuminate. You can sense truth without making others feel small. You can correct without condemning. You can reveal without humiliating. This is divine perception, knowledge that heals instead of harms, and justice that restores instead of merely punishes. In relationships, intuition becomes the sacred sense that turns judgment into right judgment, and right judgment into empathy. It allows you to see another's pattern without reducing them to it. It shows you the wound behind the reaction, the fear behind the withdrawal, the exhaustion behind the anger. It reminds you that every soul is fighting a battle between meaning and function, between the stories they tell themselves and the truths that could set them free. The intuitive self meets people at the level of essence, not performance. It doesn't ask, "Why did you do this?" but "What is this doing to you?" It seeks fruit, not theory. To live from your intuitive self is to trust that the voice of God speaks through resonance. You feel it when peace settles after a hard truth, when the air in the room changes, when both nervous systems exhale at once. This is not mysticism. It is the physiology of divine communication, the body recognizing truth before the mind can argue. When two people honor that voice together, the relationship becomes a temple. Every conversation becomes an altar where truth offers itself in living form. Without the intuitive self, relationships become prisons of projection. Each person sees only their own story mirrored back. They mistake noise for guidance and opinion for prophecy. They gather meanings like weapons and swing them at each other in the name of discernment. They lose the ability to see what love is actually doing. But when intuition leads, love regains its eyes. You begin to notice the subtle ways grace moves through imperfection, the quiet mercies that hold you when apologies fall short. You learn that divine discernment is not accumulation, it's attention. It's the discipline of noticing what's real before meaning clouds it, and of letting that reality correct you before you try to correct anyone else. The intuitive self brings this noticing back to the heart of love. It is the counselor between souls, translating spirit into presence, perception into kindness. It gives the third entity its sight and its sanity. It keeps the relationship from becoming an echo chamber of borrowed truths or a stage for competing interpretations. It lets revelation flow like light through clean glass, nothing added, nothing obscured. When this self is awake between you, you don't have to force understanding. You simply recognize it. You don't have to demand confession. Truth reveals itself. You don't have to defend your intuition. It defends itself as light does by shining. This is the quiet authority of discernment aligned with love, the divine right of the intuitive self, the eye through which love sees clearly, justice judges rightly, and healing keeps truth from turning into vengeance. New subheader: The Intuitive Self and the Contract of Knowledge. Knowledge is a covenant that you honor in action. Learn what is, then live it. Your mind is not a trophy case. It is an instrument set to the pitch of truth. You were not born to know everything. You were born to see clearly and to use what you know to create growth within yourself and impact in the world. This is the sixth of the 7 contracts of incarnation, which says, "I will learn and use what I learn." This contract demands that we treat knowledge as a covenant, not a collection case. Every moment you are either honoring that covenant or breaking it. The intuitive self is the keeper of this vow, the counselor within who perceives not just appearances, but the patterns beneath them. Its work is not to collect information, but to integrate revelation into conduct. To know something is not to hold it in your head, but to live it through your hands in ways that protect what is sacred, correct what is crooked, and create consequences worthy of truth. Perfectionism is the enemy of this process, and it's based in our impulse to value certainty over clarity and utility. We have built a civilization addicted to certainty. Certainty is the sugar of the intellect. It spikes quickly, feels empowering, and leaves us starved of real nourishment. But beneath every addiction to certainty lies trauma, the memory of moments when confusion felt dangerous, when chaos punished us, when not knowing meant getting hurt. In those moments, our nervous system built a theology of control. Perfectionism became our prayer, and information became our drug. We called it intelligence, but it was really protection. The addiction to certainty is not about truth, it's about safety. When you can't trust life to be kind, you try to make it predictable. But the soul did not come here to feel safe, it came to become free. Perfectionism is the nervous system's attempt to bargain with God. It says, if I get everything right, nothing can hurt me. If I never make a mistake, I will never feel shame again. This is not wisdom, it's fear wearing a scholar's robe. The perfectionist calls it diligence, but it's really self-abandonment disguised as self-improvement. The need to always be right is the body's way of saying, I still don't feel safe being wrong. When the trauma that taught you to equate mistakes with danger goes unhealed, you mistake vigilance for insight. You start to think too much, interpret too deeply, and filter too heavily. This hyperinterpretation of reality becomes its own prison, a counterfeit of discernment. The mind grows loud and the world grows small. Hyperinterpretation is the counterfeit of vision. It's when you stop seeing what is and start hallucinating meaning that protects your identity. It is trauma's attempt to feel in control of the uncontrollable. But interpretation is not truth, it's a filter. We are responsible for our interpretations, not for reality. When we mistake our interpretation for truth, we stop learning. We stop seeing. The contract of knowledge calls us to take radical responsibility for our filters, to clean the lens, not to rewrite the landscape. It reminds us that the human mind does not create truth. It merely participates in it, as a tuning fork participates in a vibration that already exists. The universe is already singing. The question is whether you are in key, and the moment you confuse your filter for reality, justice begins to decay, because every false reading of reality becomes a false judgment imposed on yourself, on others, or on the world. This is why one of the most dangerous ideas the Matrix has ever sold us is the old slogan, perception is reality. This sounds deep, it's also seductive, but it's demonic. Perception is not reality, it is our filter of reality. It is what we think we see, layered with our past experiences, wounds, and assumptions. When we believe perception is reality, we become prisoners of our own projections. The ego becomes God, and the world becomes its servant. We stop asking what's true and start demanding that others bow to our version of events. This is how modern narcissism and ideological warfare were born, not from evil people, but from wounded minds mistaking their filters for fact. It is also how injustice learns to wear the costume of authenticity, and why entire cultures can call distortion compassion, call indulgence healing, and call accusation discernment. When perception becomes God, everything else becomes blasphemy. The perfectionist becomes the priest of their own interpretations, enforcing dogma in the name of truth. Pride follows, the intoxication of being right. But pride has a shadow twin, self-pity. When life refuses to obey your interpretation, pride collapses into despair, asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" We ask this and cry out as if the universe were conspiring against us. But this self-pity is another mask of pride, the belief that your pain should matter more than reality itself. And when the pendulum swings again, pride resurfaces as ambition, this time cloaked in moral crusading or spiritual superiority. You become self-righteous. You turn knowledge into a weapon and perception into a religion. This is how Leviathan coils himself around your mind and drowns you in the illusion of your own correctness. The contract of knowledge exists to break that illusion. It asks you to stop worshiping certainty and start seeking clarity. Certainty is a closed door. Clarity is a window. Certainty demands. Clarity listens. Certainty controls. Clarity collaborates. The intuitive self lives in clarity. It knows that to see clearly is to be humble. Humility is not weakness. It is correct proportion. It is remembering that truth existed before you did, and that it will outlive you. Humility widens sight because it loosens the grip of ego on interpretation. It allows feedback to enter without shame and contradiction to coexist without panic. Humility is the solvent that dissolves the crust around the third eye, restoring its flow of light. And because clarity is what makes right judgment possible, humility is not merely a spiritual virtue here. It is a condition of justice. The mind that honors this contract learns to see the world, not through its preferences, but through the patterns of cause and effect. Humility stops asking, "What does this mean to me?" and starts asking, "What will this do if I don't change it?" Function and time reveal truth where opinion cannot. Watch the fruits, not the slogans. Watch the pattern of effects and trace them backward to their causes. Reality is honest when you stop trying to make it flattering. If a belief consistently yields bitterness, isolation, chaos, or moral inversion, it is false, no matter how eloquently it's defended. The mind that loves truth more than comfort becomes a vessel of revelation. It no longer needs to be right, it needs to be real. And because it needs to be real, it becomes capable of correction, consequence, and clean judgment instead of sentimentality, projection, or delay. But don't confuse humility with passivity. The contract of knowledge demands engagement. Learning is not a spectator sport. It is participatory creation. The moment you learn something true, the universe expects you to use it. Wisdom is kinetic. If insight doesn't alter your breathing, your schedule, or your boundaries, it hasn't entered you yet. It's still just information waiting to incarnate. To learn something is to let it change how you move. You don't own a truth until you embody it. To live by this contract is to be willing to test everything, even your most sacred ideas, especially your most sacred ideas. You must be willing to ask, what if I'm wrong? Not as self-doubt, but as devotion to reality. This is the humility that reopens the third eye. Each time you release the need to be right, a new layer of perception clears. Each time you admit you don't know, the truth rushes in to fill the space you made. Curiosity becomes courage. Discernment becomes love. You learn to hold beliefs lightly, strong enough to act, soft enough to evolve. You stop treating disagreement as danger and start treating it as data. You become, in the truest sense, a student of God. You can feel when this covenant comes alive in you. The body softens, the jaw unclenches, the breath lengthens, the eyes stop scanning for proof and start seeing what's actually there. The mind feels quieter, not because it's empty, but because it's coherent. Truth doesn't shout, it hums. The intuitive self learns to listen for that hum in every conversation, every book, every heartbreak. It begins to see the invisible geometry connecting all things, the subtle architecture of cause and effect, rhythm and law. Thought no longer tries to invent truth. It learns to align with it. Mentalism is not fantasy, it is fidelity. When your thought harmonizes with what is real, the world rearranges around that coherence. Not because you forced it, but because truth recognizes itself through you. This is where knowledge stops being a trophy and becomes a faculty of right response. The shadow of Leviathan, however, always lurks nearby, and his shadow waits for that 1 ounce of certainty to harden again. Here is the hinge that locks and unlocks the mind, as I taught in Chapter 3. Pride has 2 faces. One collapses inward into self-pity, passive pride. The other swells outward into self-righteousness, aggressive pride. Envy is the current that runs between them. When you enthrone perception as reality, envy compares your inner chaos to another's outer order, then flips you between poles. First the slump of, I'll never be enough, then the crusade of, I'm the one who's right. It's the same idol wearing different masks. In collapse, envy nurses grievances and calls it honesty. In crusade, envy baptizes hostility and calls it conviction. Both refuse humility, both keep the self at the center, and both are fed by the addiction to certainty, the counterfeit safety of never being wrong. The contract of knowledge breaks this carousel by returning you to responsibility for interpretation and to the discipline of reading function over time. Stop asking what things mean. Ask instead how your perceptions and interpretations are impacting your life, your body, and your relationships. When the contract of knowledge is broken, you'll know. You'll feel yourself researching instead of deciding, consuming instead of integrating, mistaking novelty for truth. You'll feel the body tighten when confronted, the throat constrict when challenged, the rush of defensiveness masquerading as intellect. But when the contract is honored, the opposite unfolds. Your no becomes cleaner. Your yes becomes quieter. Your corrections come faster. Your conversations become simpler. You no longer need to prove anything. You just tell the truth and let time prove you. You become sovereign in your mind, yet porous to revelation. This contract does not ask for brilliance. It asks for honesty. It asks you to let reality educate you, to notice what's true in function, not theory, to surrender the narcotic of certainty in exchange for the serenity of clarity. Every time you do, your mind becomes less of a battlefield and more of a sanctuary. Every false belief that falls away is not a loss, it's an exorcism. Every act of humility is an initiation into a higher intelligence, one that doesn't shout through the intellect but whispers through intuition. You might still feel fear. That's normal. The death of false certainty always feels like chaos before it feels like freedom. But when you stand in that space, eyes open, filters dissolving, you begin to see the difference between perception and reality. Reality doesn't flatter you. It doesn't care about your interpretations. It simply is. And when you finally allow that to be enough, wisdom begins. You are no longer a prisoner of perception. You are a participant in truth. I once believed certainty was power. I clung to conclusions to feel safe, defended theories to feel worthy, and called it wisdom. Now I know humility widens sight. I learn quickly, integrate honestly, and use what I learn to protect what is sacred and create what is true. Make your mind a sanctuary, not a stage. A stage begs for applause. A sanctuary listens for truth. A stage demands certainty. A sanctuary cultivates clarity. In a stage mind, perception sits on the throne and the world must obey your script. In a sanctuary mind, humility opens the windows and reality is allowed to enter as it is. This is the vow of the intuitive self, to learn quickly, to integrate honestly, and to use what you learn in the open air of life so that time can prove it. Take responsibility for your perceptions and interpretations. Do not call them reality, for that is the downward slope into the personal hell of perfectionism, isolation, and the whiplashing between self-righteousness and self-pity. And do not stop at seeing. Seeing is the doorway. Right judgment, clean action, and restoration are what walk through it. Test all knowledge and interpretations by their fruits. Connect effects back to their causes by understanding function, not meaning. When you do, pride loses its twin masks, envy loosens its grip, and the third eye clears. You won't need to be right to be free. You'll be free enough to see and faithful enough to act on what you see. New subheader, The Intuitive Self and the Principle of Mentalism. Matter is made of mind. Not mind as daydream, but mind as the living field from which all form arises. Contrary to most of the social media content on this topic, the principle of mentalism does not say that thought precedes matter. It says matter is thought in slow motion. Every stone, heartbeat, and star is mind expressing itself in density. The physicist calls this emergence countless random potentials collapsing into one coherent expression. What we touch as matter is the slow crystallization of an invisible order, like frost blooming on glass from patterns drawn by cold air. The world you can weigh is the echo of a world you can know. What appears as choice and chance is the field searching for sync, an alignment of rhythm that allows pattern to stabilize. You can see it in the murmuration of starlings, the flicker of fireflies, the metronomes on a shared beam, or the electrical whispers of the heart. Left to themselves, they find each other. This is synchronization, and sync is not an accident or coincidence. It is the grammar by which the world writes itself. The intuitive self lives near this grammar. It feels the pattern while it is still becoming. Long before the outcome appears, there is an awareness, the air before rain, the stillness before a confession, the resonance in the body before words arrive. Intuition is not rebellion against logic. It is recognition of the order that logic will one day articulate. Thought, in this frame, is not opinion. It is participation, the mind listening for the field and ceasing to work against it. This is why the intuitive self is indispensable to justice. It senses distortion while it is still condensing, hears imbalance while it is still choosing language, and perceives the crooked line before the structure built upon it has time to harden. Because the field is alive, emergence is not mechanical, it is a listening. Consider the pacemaker cells of the heart. Each fires on its own, but when they touch, they synchronize. The rhythm that appears is not owned by any cell and yet made of them all. So too with thought. Individual signals, memories, and sensations are local firings. Then suddenly a conclusion arrives, an emergent whole that no single neuron contains. We call it knowing. It feels singular because it is, a choir finding one note. Mentalism reveals that this same process unfolds on every scale. Families sync, communities sync, cultures sync. Entire civilizations become thought forms moving through history. What looks random from outside is the field selecting coherence from within. Each collapse of possibility into form carries the signature of the choices that shaped it. You can see it in architecture, laws, religions, even in language. The visible world is thought made thick. This is why meaning, when treated as performance, exhausts the soul. Meaning multiplies long after the pattern has chosen. The intellect keeps adding commentary, like rearranging water that is already frozen. Function refuses this indulgence. It asks the simpler question, what is this pattern doing as it forms? The intuitive self listens here. It is not decoding riddles. It is watching condensation. When condensation begins, you do not lecture the mist. You prepare the surface on which it will settle. If matter is mind condensed, then thought is not a private empire, but the place where the world becomes aware of itself. The intuitive self does not mistake itself for the author. It receives. It collaborates with what is forming. It knows the difference between helping and hurrying, between presence and performance. Confusion and dogma are born from losing this rhythm. Confusion runs ahead of emergence. Dogma freezes what once lived. Both fall out of sync, trading coherence for control. When sync returns, the body knows. The jaw releases, the breath deepens, the chest softens. A quiet proportion replaces argument. This is the felt signature of alignment. The world has not yet changed, but your participation has. You have stopped pushing against the grain of becoming. You have said yes to it. This consent is not passivity. It is alignment with causality at its source. Earlier teachings revealed facets of this order. Rhythm gave timing, polarity taught balance, correspondence mirrored worlds within worlds, causation traced consequence, mentalism gathers them. It is the thread that runs through them all, the recognition that every law is mind interpreting itself through form. Scripture echoes this mystery. The Katha Upanishad says, "The self of all makes the senses turn outward. Only by turning inward can one find the self." Here, the turning inward is not retreat, but reorientation, mind returning to its source to sense the field that projects the outer world. The Yoga Sutras open with a single line that names the same work, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, saying, "Yoga is the stilling of the modifications of mind. When the surface quiets, the deeper current is felt." In another canon, the prologue of John sings, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Word here is not speech, but a living ratio, the first sync, the pattern through which mind becomes matter. Mentalism is that word in motion. It is the hidden syntax through which the divine speaks structure into space and meaning into movement. When our thought harmonizes with that syntax, clarity replaces confusion. We begin to see the invisible geometry linking causes to effects, patterns to consequences. The wise mind does not seek control over form. It seeks fidelity to that unseen geometry. There is a modern habit that fights this. It invents interpretations not to understand the field, but to dodge it. Whole cosmologies get built as escape routes from mind. You can watch the sleight of hand happen in real time. A materialist bumps into the wall where matter admits it is made of order, proportion, and invisible intelligence, and instead of bowing, he renames the wall nothing. He publishes tours and explains that a quantum vacuum counts as emptiness, then uses that emptiness to pretend the universe made itself. The trick is linguistic, not luminous. Nothing becomes something with equations inside it, and the audience is told that God has been outgrown. This is not courage, it is choreography. The field keeps humming while the lecturer dances around the note. I have no quarrel with honest doubt. I do with denial that calls itself science, with reductionism that mistakes its own vocabulary for victory, and with the smug little theater in which a man strips wonder out of the cosmos, calls the corpse reality, and expects reverence for the mutilation. To stumble into mind and then sprint for new vocabulary is not discovery, it is flight. It is the oldest form of ignorance, the creation of explanations to circumvent truth. The universe does not blush when we rename its source. It keeps showing us sync. It keeps collapsing possibility into proportion. It keeps speaking order. The mind that refuses to hear it grows louder, not wiser. The heart of this principle also reveals why envy gathers around it. Envy is the refusal to trust one's place in the pattern. It compares rhythms instead of listening for resonance. It wants another's coherence without the inner diet that made it possible. In that static, Leviathan thrives, and once envy enters judgment, it does not merely compare, it falsifies. It resents proportion, resists rightful order, and begins calling theft fairness, imitation originality, and accusation discernment. The intuitive self restores sync through humility, the quiet certainty that truth already has a rhythm and does not require imitation, only recognition. This is where the storehouse image sharpens into daily life. Desire is orientation. You face a truth you can no longer ignore. Will gathers behind that orientation. Action follows without theater. Destiny is not a script that overpowers you. It is the shape your days take when orientation and action stop arguing. A marriage heals because two people finally face the same north. A business stabilizes because the builder chooses craft over spectacle. A mind grows gentle because it stops performing and starts listening. The chain in the old text is not mystical arithmetic. It is how a life condenses out of a field. The same field that breathes through matter is what mystics called the mind of God. Yogacara describes an alaya vijnana, a storehouse consciousness from which perceptions arise and to which they return. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad traces the arc from subtle to gross with its chain. As is one's desire, so is the will. As is the will, so is the deed. As is the deed, so is the destiny. This tells us that desire is not craving. It is orientation of mind within the field. Will follows, then act, then outcome. To know this order is not to dominate it, but to harmonize with it until perception stops being personal and becomes luminous. The New Testament letter of James 3:17 offers a test for such luminosity, saying, "The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere." Wisdom reveals itself by what it generates. Purity and peace announce coherence. Gentleness and openness signal that the field is not being forced. Good fruit is time's agreement. When thought is aligned, a single word carries the power of many. It vibrates with reality and heals. This is the speech of the intuitive self, brief, precise, unforced. It speaks when the pattern has fully formed. Each of the earlier principles shows its reflection here without being retaught. Rhythm lends mentalism its tempo, so recognition does not rush or stall. Polarity gives it contrast, so the mind can hold seeming opposites until they reveal themselves as degrees of one current. Correspondence translates between inner and outer, so the same geometry can be read at every scale. Causation grants the dignity of sequence, so we stop mistaking effects for sources. From here, vibration carries the song into motion. Everything that exists is movement arranged by rate. What you name mood in a room is only rate made felt. What you call culture in a nation is only rate averaged across millions of bodies. Change the rate and the pattern reorganizes. When mind hums at a clear frequency, forms adjust. Walls that held now echo. Words that once scattered begin to gather. The final law will show why motion serves union. All currents resolve toward wholeness. Mentalism shows the architecture. Vibration supplies the breath. Completion will show why the breath returns to its source. This motion is not abstract. It moves between people. In the space two souls share, there is a third reality made of their exchange. When sight is clean, that third presence sees itself. It senses when fear tightens the air and when honesty relaxes it. It knows the difference between performance and presence without accusation. The intuitive self is its eye. It keeps that space from becoming a courtroom of projection, vanity, and premature verdicts, and lets it remain a temple where truth can be spoken cleanly enough for justice and healing to enter together. In this harmony, beauty and kindness reappear as natural byproducts. Beauty is coherence made visible. Kindness is truth expressed without injury. Isaiah's line in the Old Testament, Isaiah 30:15, reads, "In quietness and trust shall be your strength." Quietness here is not withdrawal, it is sync, the calm of a mind that no longer mistakes commentary for creation. A teaching from the Davajanya tradition puts it in the language of craft. The sage does not try to command the wind. He trims the sail. Mind is the wind. Thought is the sail. To fight it is to drift. To adjust is to move in rhythm with the divine. A line from the Dhammapada, twin verses 13 to 14, F. Max Miller translation, adds its weight. As the rain penetrates a badly thatched house, so passion penetrates an undeveloped mind. As the rain does not penetrate a well-thatched house, so passion does not penetrate a well-developed mind. Here we see that development is not accumulation, it is coherence. A well-thatched mind keeps the field's rhythm. The weather can rage and still not enter. Such is the work of the intuitive self. It protects creation from impatience and reminds the mind of its purpose, not to dominate reality but to translate it faithfully. It listens until the form is ready, then acts without noise. It lets the beam find its rhythm and the clocks keep time together. It turns envy into admiration, knowledge into reverence, and intellect into witness. It restores thought to its rightful seat as servant of revelation, not master of meaning. And because it does, it keeps perception from curdling into tyranny and keeps justice from losing its way in the fog. When you live in this sync, life stops feeling like a puzzle and starts sounding like a song remembering its melody. You begin to notice intervals between things, the breath that moves them. Matter hums again. Rooms carry different weight when truth is present. Conversations find their pitch without rehearsal. Decisions land without spectacle. The world feels less like resistance and more like resonance. Then the principle that has whispered since the beginning is no longer abstract. Mind and matter were never two. They are the same song in different octaves. The music did not need your permission. It needed your honesty. It needed you to stop performing long enough to hear it, and to stay faithful long enough to let it finish its phrase.
End of Chapter 10, Part 1 of Awaken Your Shadow by Seth Cherupak.